Hi everyone, welcome to today's seminar for the School of Applied Sciences at Abertay University. I'm Chris Watkins, seminar organiser. We have two more speakers scheduled this term and a separate public lecture organised by myself and the Psychology Society on the 31st of March, details of which are imminent. So to introduce to you today's speaker, and as a reminder, as usual, you can post your questions for the Q&A session for about the last sort of 15 minutes or so. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Adam Miklosi. Adam gained a PhD in ethology from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and has since received various awards, including being an elected member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in 2016. He is currently Professor of Ethology at Eötvös Loránd University in Hungary, where he is also head of the Ethology department. Adam is a world expert in dog cognition and behaviour, publishing in excess of 300 papers, including papers in prestigious journals such as Science, Biological Reviews and Current Biology. He is co-founder and leader of the Family Dog Project, which aims to explore human-dog interactions from an ethological perspective and can be accessed at dognition.com. Adam will give a concise overview of some of his fascinating research into this area over his career. Adam, thank you very much for coming to speak to us at Abertay today and sharing your research. And I'll hand over to you and your slides just now.
Okay, thank you very much for this very nice introduction, and hello everybody. I'm really happy that so many people have joined this presentation. And actually, I try to sort of make a blended talk in a sense that I won't only talk about our research here in Budapest, but rather actually to focus more on the cognitive issues of dog behavior and problem solving. And also because I have a very limited time, so basically I think around 40 minutes, as many people who listen to this might understand that actually that time is actually not enough to give a really detailed overview. So I usually in this case decide to focus on some particular approaches so that you can go away with something more specific rather than just to run through many experiments that we did in the last 30 years of researching on dog cognition and problem solving behavior. So the first slide is basically a reminder for everybody that dogs are, in a sense, very special animals, special species. There is this very strong connection with humans that has been established during the last, let's say, 20 or 50,000 years. And we also have an ancestor, a wolf or wolf-like species that actually during this time evolved into something that we call now dogs. Whether today dogs and the past dogs are different or the same is not the matter of today's discussion, but anyway we have this step-by-step transition from having wolves only on Earth now having wolves and dogs on the Earth. And these later species, I mean the dogs, had really some sort of a close connection with humans. So in summary, what we could talk about is that dogs evolve in and develop in a human social niche. Now obviously when we are talking about dogs today, I always, actually not really always, but mainly I will talk about family dogs. So those dogs who, some of them actually maybe yet now are your legs or close into your lap, or wherever you are, maybe you are listening to this walking in the park. So dogs are around, and they have, usually the family dogs have an owner and even a family where they arrive in as a puppy or as an adult dog and develop a very complex social relationship with humans. Generally, and I know I talk to many of you who are psychologists, humans are regarded as a very or exceptionally social species. And when we started our research, we were quite aware of that. That's also why our research group is actually has the name of Family Dog Research. We always actually focus not just on the dog, but also on the human counterpart. So this is just a list of those human skills, if you like, social skills, that are very specific to humans. And these are not just quantitative differences, but sometimes even qualitative differences when we compare humans versus, for example, apes in generally. So we have these skills in mind, and you could imagine that the basic challenge for all of the dogs that actually we live together with is how they can be successful in a social niche that is controlled or framed, or I don't like the word dominated, but anyway, very strongly influenced by another very social being, the humans. So basically, just to give you again a framework, this is the way how I sort of portray what's actually going on. We have this social niche has, or we could be portrayed as having three important factors. One is the factor that is a general sociality. Then another important factor is synchronization, that the individuals in that social niche are acting together a lot of the time during their life or during the everyday interactions. And by the way, they also constructing together a lot of things or non-material stuff. So for example, we are talking to each other, we exchange thoughts. This is also a sort of a construction. We are cooperating a lot of times, and so on. And obviously these skills, or some of these skills, also exist in the dogs. So basically the question is now how these two individuals or species work together in a specific social niche by relying on their skills in various ways. So importantly also, I think I should stress that there is this general problem of problem-solving behavior that probably ethologists like me should prefer. They don't always do it, but that's actually what they should, versus cognition, that is probably something that is more familiar and is more used by psychologists. And why I prefer the former is because when we are talking about the behavior, especially about the behavior of animals, then it's much easier to actually thinking on terms of behavior and clarifying that it's actually not so interesting from an evolutionary point of view that what goes on in the mind of those animals, rather actually what they are able to achieve in that human social niche. So that's where actually I invented, I must say, this definition for problem-solving behavior. For me, it's a working definition, so I'm happy to accept critics about it. So basically, the idea is that problem-solving behavior reflects changes in an animal's behavior when it responds to advantageous way to regular states of the environment. The advantage of this behavior, this definition, is that we don't have to discuss whether the behavior is simple or complex, which is usually a debate between people or scientists. And another aspect is also we don't have to get into debates of learning, what kind of learning explains it, or whether what kind of high-level complex cognitive phenomena are behind what we actually see. Obviously, that could be also a valid question to study, but that's, I think, not the first where we should start. So what I try to show you today is really giving examples on these three factors. Probably I won't have time to actually talk about all of them, so I don't know how fast I can speed. Actually, I don't even want to speed up my speech, so probably I just will keep going slowly. And if somebody will miss some part of that, I mean that we don't have time, probably there will be a chance to read about this in the literature, but that's also partly based on our work. Okay, so the first component, and I think that is very strongly related to what we might call cognition, but actually relates to the problem-solving behavior of dogs, is sociality. So, and that's what is very trivial, and it goes back actually, as usually where we go back is to go back to Darwin, and you can see also this citing from Darwin is that he already talked about the very special social behavior of dogs, saying that it is the love of man that brought about the change in the instincts of domestic dogs. So basically, what he talks about love is probably today we would say some very complex sociability in the dogs, and also other writers like Jeffrey Mason or more recently Clive Wynne actually take a lot of time to discuss this very special feature of dog behavior that we call sociability in general. Interestingly, even we know that humans are generally very social, there are some changes, genetic effects in humans that can make us even more social. And this is an example, that I would like to share with you. Actually, the group led by von Holt worked a lot and are still working on this a lot, trying to find out whether there are some genetic effects that could be explained, could help to explain social behavior in the dogs. So their approach was or is looking at the human counterpart of this situation by analyzing the gene or the genes actually, or this genetic deletion that is causing the so-called William-Bryan syndrome, which makes people who actually carry this mutation very social in general. Obviously, there are some other features that are come in parallel, so it means delayed development, cognitive impairment, but what is really critical from this perspective now is the hypersociability of these people. They are very open to everybody. They are really very interested in having social interactions and so on. So they think that maybe similarly or in an analogous way to the human situation, there's something might have happened during the dog domestication that makes these species especially social. So what they did actually was looking at what they call hypersociability in dogs in comparison to wolves. And obviously from an experimental approach, there are many ways to investigate this. We also have some other hypotheses in parallel. I won't, maybe I will talk about this a bit, about the neuroendocrinological differences or hypotheses that usually are connected to changed or increased oxytocin levels in the more social species, so to speak. But actually, this also is related to the problem-solving behavior. So when somebody or a species is hypersocial, it should actually decrease independent problem-solving behavior and relying on the partner in solving problems. This could be also connected to neoteny, which is another aspect, basically, that dogs are not just hypersocial per se, but actually what is interesting is that they formed a very close social relationship with another species, so not with dogs, and this starts already very early when they are in the puppy times, and also that they develop what we call an attachment, and this attachment is actually functionally and to some extent also behaviorally very similar to what we see in humans, not just actually the mother and the infant, or the father or the parents and the infant, but also among adult humans. So just to show you the basic starting point, and also at the same time an experiment. So, and I think that the fastest thing is to show the video. So this is a typical problem situation. What you can see, the dog has learned to get the food from the cage by pulling this string or this rope, but now the rope is connected or fastened to the cage, so he can't get to the food. And what you see is this behavior that is now researched a lot and debated a lot, but actually the action is very simple. The dog stops at some point and looks back at the human that is who is at the end of the leash, as you can probably imagine from this picture. And this is very typical, happens usually within a few 10 seconds after the dog is faced with the insolvable situation. Now, if you do the same, if you expose wolves to the same situation, then this is what happens. Both actually puppies are about 4 months old, so they are of the same age, and they were socialized very much in the same way. Here's the dog puppy, and he will also start pulling the rope, and it won't actually work for him. But what you can also see is, what you don't see is this, what we call the looking back behavior. And this is actually very important, that it should be looking back and not just looking at the human, because really looking back indicates that the dog or the wolf has had stopped interest, at least in this problem, and tries to look for some alternative solutions. Now, at the moment, as you can see, the wolf is not really interested in changing his mind, and he's just focusing on the task and so on. So this is the action, what we are interested in. And the assumption is that the animal is, let's say, hypersocial if he is performing this looking back behavior faster and more often and so forth. So in this study von Holst, they used actually many of such tests, not just this one, but some others, and they arrived to, let's say, 3 factors, depending how they calculated the results. One factor or one variable that they were basically obtaining from these comparisons was attention bias to social stimuli. So how much the animals were interested in humans in general, how much time they spent with looking, gaze alternation, and so forth. The other was what they call hypersociability, which is in this case special to proximity measures. And the third was interest in strangers, which is actually also an important variable, because generally strangers are representing some sort of danger. So in natural species, a stranger is something that you should avoid. Now, if you are not avoiding strange humans, in this case in canids, then this is probably a sign of some sort of general social interest towards that species. And as you can see, for all 3 measures, we can see an advantage. In the case of dogs, they are significantly have obtained significantly higher values in hypersociability, in attentional bias, and not so much in the interest of strangers, but that has also some other reasons. And when you measure independence, then you can see actually the opposite, that wolves are more independent than dogs. And what you should actually also know, that these animals, the researchers usually make sure that both dogs and wolves who are involved in that sort of studies are socialized at a similar level. Okay, just to show you, and actually I'm happy to share this presentation, obviously, and you can watch it later because it's recorded, so I might just skip some of them, and then you can still have a picture to watch it. So here we can just show some other independent researchers finding the same things. So basically, if you're comparing the 2 species that are socialized to the similar level, or sort of to the similar level, you find similar differences. Dogs are generally more social, so it's not particular to that study that I'm actually described now a little bit in more detail. What, however, Van Holt and her group also found is that there were some specific genetic markers that stand out significantly from all the other possible genetic locations that seem to be associated with that factor, so seem to be associated with dogs that were more social compared to the wolves, and we don't have time to go into the details, but basically they are measuring this by the levels of the p factor or the p value in the statistical test, and if the values are very, very tiny, then it is assumed that probably this is not a chance effect, but rather there is some statistically significant association. And the assumption is now based on that obviously in contrast to humans, however, what is more exciting, that these genetic locations were actually similar to the human locations. So not at the same chromosome, but at a similar genetic structure. The idea is that they might have been a positive selection for that part of the chromosome actually, and this could be one cause that made the dogs so-called hypersocial in general. Now, it's interesting that that was found. However, if you are approaching this from a ethological or behavior perspective, then the insights are not so trivial. And the reason obviously for this is that there are some other variations. So it's not just that we have dogs and wolves, but that could be differentiated based on some genetic alterations, but rather there is an epigenetic effect, a developmental effect, and so on and so forth. So people in the Wolf Science Center in Vienna investigated this hypothesis from a behavior perspective, looking at this hypersociability hypothesis and testing dogs and wolves in a more systematic ways. And this experiment was very simple. Actually, they took two persons. One person offered food, another person offered contact, so basically petting, stroking, and just being very kind to the dog. And the dogs were tested with those people or before, so they had experience about both people. And then in the test, both people stand there, and the dog or the wolves had to make a choice, or they could make a choice. They don't have to. They just made a choice or not. So, and the question was, okay, do we find differences between those dogs and wolves in that comparison, and also whether dogs actually are showing some sort of preference for the petting human. So for those person who is actually offering this rather very specific social contact. And what you can see in those figures is that actually there is during the pre-test, so when they just had the chance to be exposed to the persons, dogs actually had showed a very high preference for the petting person, for the contact person, as it is the CP is referring to that person. And you can see that is most of the dogs actually spend a lot of time with her. That was not so typical for the wolves, although the wolves were also a little bit, they showed also some preference. However, when they measured the test performance, so when there was a choice, then interestingly, the dogs were those animals who, and this is the figure now in the right corner on top, the dogs were making a choice. So they very rapidly actually, they went to the humans and made a choice. The wolves, for the wolves, it doesn't seem to be so important to actually get close to another human in the test. But when we were looking at whether there was a specific preference for the petting person, then neither species showed any such thing. So most actually were choosing around roughly randomly or a chance level of 50-50%. So interestingly, this sociability, whenever it exists or not, that doesn't really seem to be functioning in a way that we sort of naively expect, that if a person is behaving more socially compared to a person that is not so social, would automatically evoke an approach and more interest from typical dogs and typical wolves in this case. And this is what I also mentioned, that there's another form of dogs that we very rarely actually look at, but this is also very important because these dogs are genetically dogs in a sense, but their experience with humans are rather different. And these are those free-ranging dogs that, for example, you can also find if you go to some African countries and you're enjoying the holiday at the seaside, and then you find those free-ranging dogs that don't seem to have an owner, but they have a sort of a loose relationship towards people. Actually, some could be even petted, other maybe not so much, and they seem to be quite uniform in look, and again, they have some social experiences. So if we involved, or if the researchers in Vienna involved also those dogs, then you could actually hypothesize that maybe the companion dog should still perform or should show a preference to a higher level because they have a very more or a closer relationship with their human owners. And interestingly, and here I just show one figure, this is not really the case, or at least this is not what they found. So they found that duration for the petting person was actually a little bit even higher in the free-ranging dogs compared to companion dogs that were tested under more or less similar conditions. Obviously, it's quite difficult to make everything being the same, but the trend is not what we would have expected if the hypersocialization hypothesis is true. And also in the same experiment, when we look at the choice, so choice between the food provider and the contact provider person, again, we don't see that family dogs or any other dogs actually would show a big difference in this case. So we have to be, I think, very careful with how we explain this, and just to show you also a little bit on the other side, because some people believe, and this is very interesting, that behavior data are sort of a soft data. Who knows what goes on? I mean, we are just observing, we are just measuring. So the hard data comes from hormones or heart rate or other physiological measures, and this could be actually true in some sense. So here we can see that, yes, oxytocin, for example, can be measured in dogs and wolves, but the results don't really point in the same direction. So in one study on the left, that was the data from Nagasawa, from Japanese researchers, we can really see that the oxytocin levels and changes in the dogs are actually more marked compared to the wolves in this case. But on the right side, the measures from Viropsky at the Wolf Science Center, they just got the opposite, sort of the opposite results, or not really a difference between dogs and wolves in levels of oxytocin independently how they actually measure it. So, and also when you talk about a physiologist, I mean dog physiologist, they might actually say that, well, these oxytocin levels, especially in dogs, could also be associated with the differences in breeding and some other factors. So we don't, at the moment, we can't claim that just the fact that oxytocin levels might be different could explain the difference in sociability between dogs and wolves. Moreover, when we're looking at the only within dogs, then what we really see here is, and I think we just should concentrate on the figure in the middle, sort of, that when we measure body contact between people and the oxytocin level in the dog during the same duration, that we find a correlation only when the dogs are interacting with the owners, and not if they're interacting with family persons. If the family person, the dots are more or less random. If they interact with the owner, you can see this sort of the line that I have made a little bit stronger, that you can also see it from the original paper. So this means that this system is probably it's finer tuned than we would expect based on some very simple hypothesis. So to summarize this part, I think we could argue that probably, and I mean, we can't really, shouldn't debate it, that sociability in dogs has a genetic basis that has been selected for in domestication. And there's probably some sort of an association, and there should be some association between genetic variability and behavior variability. But it seems to be that this association is sort of easier to show when we compare very distant related species, I mean relatively distant related species, wolves and dogs. Rather, if we just try to compare or look for this association within dogs that have a different background, or even if the background of those wolves are really very varied in terms of socialization. So, and obviously, the hypothesis about the Williams syndrome should be also taken with care, because as we know, in humans, this is a quite complex condition, and hypersociability is only one feature of that, that condition in general. So I think there are more questions at the moment that we were expecting or that we could answer, and really how sociability is influencing dogs' behavior should be subject to further research with probably more detailed investigations. Okay. A very different topic. It's about you should remember this first graph about this interacting social niches from dogs and humans. This topic is more related to the communication and specifically to the what is just for short, I would refer to as referential communication. Although there are a lot of issues how this notion or this definition that is very well known and accepted in humans could be really translated to animals. However, it's very interesting to find out that dogs are able to follow human verbal commands. Now, that means that when we are telling the dog to sit, to come, to go, to lay down, and so on, obviously there is some need for some formal training, or sometimes it just develops spontaneously. Dogs are actually doing what they are told. At least we can use, let's say, 5-10 such commands or signals. And when we are asking actually dog owners and what they think about how many such verbal instructions, signals dogs understand, then they come up with sometimes with 20, 50, or sometimes even more. Obviously, it doesn't really mean that the dogs are recognizing all those signals as specific, and there's a lot of other effects that play a role in that the dog actually is executing the action that we request from them. But as you can see from this paper published by Ramos and Mills a few years ago, that actually even in a formal experimental situation, dogs can be trained to sit or to sit at an object or point at an object by using specific verbal commands. So this means that dogs can learn action names. And I think this is important because this helps a lot in the dog-human interaction. Obviously, I was talking about learning in this case, about learning of verbal signals, but this also is very useful in terms of synchronization, so synchronizing the activities of dogs and humans. For example, when we are moving in the city or going for a walk, a dog that could be controlled by such verbal commands is actually a lot of help and won't hit by cars so frequently or by bicycles and so on. So this is on one hand side. What I think is really interesting is that a few years ago, maybe some people remember that story from Science 2004. It was reported that there is a dog, or actually Rico has deceased now, so there was a dog, Rico, and the same story was repeated by another dog chaser who knew at that time around 2,000 object names, basically toy names. You can see there Rico actually on the picture on the right corner on the top, and this is only part of his toys. So, and obviously when we talk to dog owners, they claim that the dog knows toy object names, but this is usually not true. The only way to test is what you can also see now here on the picture. So basically you separate the owner from the dog and I'm the owner from the object, and the objects are in the other room, and basically you are playing this retrieving task that you tell the dog, okay, get this or that object, and the dog should run to another room, basically trying to avoid all the clever hands and all these effects. And if he picks the right object and brings it back a few times, obviously, or much over chance, then we can be sure that he knows the names of these objects. Now, interestingly, how Rico and also Chaser, the other dog, learned that the impression was at that time that this is sort of similar what might happen in children, because Rico for sure was actually learning these words, these human words or object labels, more probably better expressed this way, automatically, spontaneously. The owner was not training the dog at all. It just sort of happened. Just like what happens when children start to talk about objects and naming them when they are interacting with their parents or some others. And this is a relatively rapid process and happens very early, and especially in the situation where children are not, we don't really expect from them to be very highly advanced in terms of cognition and so on. So this is sort of something that is a very interesting feature of the human mind, how these arbitrary vocal labels are associated somehow with objects and so on. So interestingly, a few years ago, we found such a dog, basically totally accidentally. The name of the dog is Whiskey, and you can see Whiskey and Helge Oswela, his owner, very proudly on the left. And Whiskey acted very much like Rico did. So the story was very much the same. It's a totally anecdotal story. So when we met actually and talked about Helge, with Helge about this, it found out that yes, Helge had no idea about Rico. He had no idea about dog cognition research. He just had a dog he wanted to interact with and started to name toys, and the dog retrieved them. And then somehow Helge found out that the dog knows really a lot of toy names. So we decided that, okay, I mean, either it could be accidental, so maybe we just have very special dogs just come to light every 10 years, or maybe there is a way to actually make dogs knowing these labels. So we decided, and here I really had to refer to Claudia Fugazza and Shani Dror, who actually are doing most of this research at present, is that we took 15 adult dogs, 15 puppies. I mean, it was a huge effort to convincing owners that they should now try to teach the dogs specific object labels or names. And it was a general practice. We had worked how Helge and how Rico's owner was explaining, basically just playing and enjoying this time and naming the object and so on. We also had, by that time, I should also mention, because in the results it will be shown, 6 dogs that provided evidence earlier that they know a lot of object names. So these acted as a sort of a control dogs who from them we know that they know object names, and they were also engaged in the study, so their owners also had the same task to teach the dog new object names. So both of these all of these 36 dogs actually started the task along as a specific protocol. For all the owners, we provided a weekly consultation, so they did this training at home, came to the department, we helped them, explained them, practiced them, and they came back from time to time for tests. And just to give you some insight of how this actually works with Whiskey, I show you a short video about, this is about from Whiskey's experiments that was actually run or put together for the specific publication that we had, and we want to look it through, but just to see that this is the basic condition where the owner and the experimenter is in the kitchen. So the experimenter tells the owner what he should ask for, then Whiskey disappears and then they goes into the other room, and you can see he is looking around and fetching the object, or one object, and it turns out in the kitchen that yes, this was the right object. He becomes some food, because actually otherwise it's very difficult to make dogs to work for a long, very, very long time. And interestingly, this was in Norway. So Claudia, who is in Italian, she actually learned the Norwegian words, and even then Whiskey was successful with this behavior. So interestingly, what you can also see now here is, again, the dog is told a familiar name. So now the dog can fetch is probably the right objects. I don't know. Everybody's happy that it should be like this. So now what happens in this experiment, this trial, the dog is now told a new name. So a name of an object that he has never heard before. Okay, this is the dolphin in this case now. And what we can see that the dog actually is very uncertain, first of all, what he should do, but obviously this is a little bit anthropomorphism, but finally he actually finds an object that he has seen for the first time, but what you can also see is that now the dog is not so rapidly retrieving it, but actually is really investigating the object in a very much in a dog way. And eventually, after a few seconds, he will come back. People in the kitchen are already quite concerned what's going on in the room, but eventually he comes back. Okay, so this is just to get you a little bit, insight how these experiments are running in general. So going back to this study now, here what we can see is, so we basically there were formal tests of success in the first month, in the second month, and in the third month. And as you can see, however the owners tried, however we tried helping the owners in this situation, the red line here shows, so sorry, I just yes, so the red line here for the typical dog shows that there's no preference or no choice for the learned object, how long we train, and actually they never get better than 2. So because if they had learned to differentiate 2 objects, then we actually would move to a new object, the third one, but it never happened. We only had 2 for those, but they never succeeded, and so on. Those dogs who knew already 6 objects, they knew already objects' names, they could actually make this difference. So from them, additional 2 objects made no change. They were just good as they are usually with different objects. Now, if we look at the details, you can also see here that by the way, those dogs who what we call those dogs who were the dogs who learned already the names of the objects, they learned not just the 2 objects, but they went on and even learning more. So the red columns are also suggesting that in the second month, in the second month, they already learned another, A6, and in the third month, they learned another 6. So basically, by the end of the experiments, those dogs who already knew a few names learned about 15 object names overall, compared to those who didn't learn any. There was one exception, and this confused me for a little bit. This the dog that we call was Oliva, and this was the only dog from the dogs that we call typical dogs who actually learned more object names. Like in the first month, she learned I think let's say 10, and in the next month she learned 11, which was quite surprising for us. Unfortunately, it was really pretty because Oliva died soon after the experiment for some totally unrelated health issues. So we couldn't really figure out why was Oliva such a special dog. But generally, all the others, so this is from 30 dogs or 1, all the other 29 dogs are basically here, but you don't see anything because they didn't perform, they didn't achieve any learning at all during these 3 months. I must also say that some owners gave up earlier, so it was not really impossible. It was impossible to convince them to continue this experiment. So this is, I think, very interesting, and also what we did in 2020, and this study now has been also published last year, that these dogs were entered in a challenge. This means that they had to learn 6 objects in the first week, and they were tested at the end of the week, and you can see the results of this challenge, and they were around 80% as a group. In the second week, they had to learn 12 objects, and they were tested at the end of the week, and again, they performed quite high, so 80% overall, and you can see the chance level is really at a very low, set at the low level, because they had to make these choices from several objects. In experiments 3 and 4, what we did was actually we put away the objects after finishing this training. So they were really put in boxes and very far from the dogs. And we tested the dogs again after 1 month and after another month, so after 2 months, on different objects. So objects for the second month were again some new objects that were not tested the months before. So again, obviously, the memory was not so strong in compared to the shorter term memory. So, but I still remembered much better than chance, which probably won't be even true for myself if I had to do that same task. So it seems to be that really these dogs are first of all special, and they learn in a sort of a way like children. At least I think it's a very interesting situation that we have these dogs. Now, again, it's very interesting because we don't know at the moment whether it's really a chance effect that these dogs are somehow have a genetic random development added with some special social situations when these skills are surfacing, or whether there is some really common genetic parameter that actually is present in all these dogs. This will be the research for the next few years, and it's actually very complicated because there are not so many of them, and generally for genetic research you need large numbers of individuals to come up with some good figures and convincing arguments. So that's why I also want to say that if anybody knows such dogs, please let us know. We are looking still for subjects, and we're doing these experiments, or everything is online, not just because the pandemic, but also because it's impossible, because these dogs actually are coming, some from the US, others from Brazil, from Netherlands, Norway, some actually are in England. So it's really there's no other way to actually do this research. I think this is again interesting because also, and I like to make this parallel, here we're facing something that we refer in humans as talent. And when we look at this, usually there has been this interesting perspective change in our view. So first of all, how ethology began was anecdotal observations, few animals, even special stories, and so on. And obviously in some cases, for example, in the language learning research in apes, it still remained the case that you had individuals who or everybody probably remembers the Alex, the famous parrot, and so on. So we have these individual studies. Obviously we learned that this is not the way how you do science, because you're looking for populations, you're looking for population means, and you look for differences in those means, and depending on how you are treating them, or what kind of changes you do to your system. But now it's interesting that in humans, we also have a third level, if you like, and this is especially now important in modern pedagogy, looking for, again, for individuals and adjust the teaching, for example, not to the group, but rather making it to special for individuals in the class or individuals in the kindergarten and so on. And this is based on the idea that people are different, and everybody might have something that who is or more or less talented. But on the top of it, we also know that in humans, we have special people, so to speak, who are very much talented in some respects. So, for example, there are mathematicians that are really very, very special, and they are very extreme. They sort of represent extreme values, let's put it this way. So I think, as in animals, it never came up this issue whether you have something similar in animals. Obviously, it's very difficult to find those because we don't really know what is a skill and how you can be exceptional in that skill if you are an animal, let's say a dolphin. So whether there are, we know that dolphins can swim very fast, but we don't know what would be an extreme fast swimmer dolphin. Although we know who is an extremely fast swimmer human. So, and I think this insight, so apart from this interesting aspect that dogs are, or some dogs seem to learn object labels very fast, and not just few, but actually many, this biologically speaking represents a situation where you might actually study talent in animals with regard to a very specific feature, very specific ability. Okay, the last part of the talk, if I have still a little bit of time, would again go back to the vocal communication. And actually here it's probably a more mutual situation. What we also observe in dogs, and this is this quite old figure, shows that dogs are relatively vocal animals compared to all those very silent mammals that we generally face. I mean, in the wild. So when you go out, usually you don't hear mammals crying or moaning or growling or snarling or doing all this time, because it's very logical. Actually, if you are a predator, you want to be silent. If you are a prey, you want to be silent as well. So However, the dogs are not like that. They are typically noisy, and as if you are a neighbor of such dogs, you will know what I'm talking about. They can be actually quite disturbing sometimes. Now, interestingly, when we are comparing now these sounds, we can also see that dogs are not just producing these vocalizations, and you can see there are quite a lot of them, but actually some of them are vocalizing using the same type of vocalization in specific situations. So, and this is a difference compared to wolves. Wolves are using these vocalizations, so whining, growling, and so on, in very specific ways. They have if you like, a specific meaning. Dogs are more variable. They sort of express themselves, their inner states, in a more varied ways. And why this is interesting, because we hypothesized that maybe this could be explained that for humans, vocalization is very important. We express a lot of our emotions by different types of vocalizations. So maybe this would help us, or it helped us to understand, to relate, to synchronize with the dogs when we selected for those animals who have a more varied vocalization that can be decoded better by us. And there are many experiments, and obviously I can't go through all of them, showing that this vocal communication actually goes in both ways. So not just we humans are able to recognize our the dog's inner states, if you like, emotions, by listening only to their barks, for example, but also, as you can see, dogs are reacting to human vocalization in a very specific ways. So in this study, for example, it's actually a very old study, researchers compared dogs' reaction to crying, humming, and talking, and you can see major differences in their reaction, how interested the dogs were, how close to went to the vocalizing person, depending on the type of vocalization they be produced. And in addition to that, which is obviously not surprising if you have some behavioral analogies between dogs and humans, it actually was sort of a relief to find out neurobiological support for such data. So in Budapest, we were among the first who pioneered in putting dogs in fMRI scanners. That means that you had to train them for being calm, and this is the usual paradigm that is used. So we have the dogs are in this scanner for around 6 minutes. They are really trained not to move at all, so their movement is very tiny. Otherwise, this part could not be analyzed from the experiment. And then they are exposed to different sounds, and their brain is scanned. We're looking for activity in the brain and summarize it over the 6 minute period. And here I should also mention Marta Gaci, who pioneered in the training of these dogs, and Attila Andic, who is the neurobiologist in our group, who is actually analyzing those very complicated results that you can obtain after such an experiment. And what you can also do here, and what's really exciting with this method, is that obviously we don't just put the dogs in the scanner, but you can also put the humans in the scanner. It's actually much easier. We don't have to train them. And the situation is that both, you can assume that humans and dogs are exposed to the same vocal or auditory environment. So we hear the same generally: cars, bicycles, dogs, humans, cats, and so on, as the dogs. So the brain that you are studying has been exposed to the same stimuli in general, but you can also expose them to the specific stimulus and stimuli. And in this case, this is human vocalizations and dog vocalizations. Now, what this figure shows is, and in a summary, is that first of all, we have these colors, and these vocalizations had an emotional content, and this content was sort of coded independently from this experiment. So people were asked to listen to dog vocalizations and human vocalizations and score them whether they were, let's say, having a positive valence and another a negative valence. And what you can also see here, so this is the the auditory cortex of humans, and on left and right, and in the humans, I don't go into details very much, but basically what we see here is that if you compare now, look at these colors, the color represent preferential areas that get active during the listening to a specific vocalization, then you can see that what we actually very nicely replicated, that the auditory brain, or this part of the temporal lobe of humans, is active when they hear human sounds, which is actually quite normal. And it's not active when humans are listening to dog vocalization. So it means that humans have a preferential location in the brain for analyzing human sound, and not especially, and there is not such a location for the dog sounds. And we found sort of the counterpart in the dog brain, that is here, these blue arrows at the sylvian gyrus, where this indicates that when the dogs are listening to dog sounds, then these areas get active, and also this medial part of the ectosylvian gyrus, and they are not. We don't find any particular part of the dog brain that might be active when when they hear human vocalization. Okay, so this means that probably mammal species in general have a specific locations in their brain that is sensitive or gets preferentially activated when conspecific sounds are heard from the environment. Now, when we were looking at the emotional aspect, so basically looking at the emotional representations of the vocalizations, and you can see that the sensitive parts for the positive emotions was, in the case of humans, this yellowish orange, and then we have the purple for the dogs, the same. Then you can see that the human brain on both sides, more expressed on that side, actually on the right side, you see that the activation for the positive dog sounds and the human positive sounds are overlapping, and are both actually in the temporal area, which means that, or suggests at least, that the human brain, although it is not specifically responding whether it's a dog or a human sound, but we sort of know that this is a positive sound independently from the species who is producing it, or and this is the analysis happens in the same brain area, probably on both sides of the brain. Importantly, maybe dominant to one side. Importantly, what we also find for the dogs is the sort of the same. That means that you can see now this yellowish orange and the purple overlapping in the dog brain. So dogs are again doing the same at the neural level, at least, suggesting that, well, the dog brain is generally functioning in the same way as a human brain. Basically, this might explain why dogs are reacting to a human cry in a similar way as if they would react to a whining dog, because the analysis results in the same outcome for a dog, that this is a voice that I should approach and be interested, show some positive interest towards. So again, summarizing this point, we at least have some evidence that really in the vocal communication case, there is a very strong connection between humans and dogs. This could be explained on the basis of also some neural aspects, that the brains are functioning very much in a similar ways, and at the end that might result in this features that what we feel or at least think or believe, if you like, that dogs are very emotional. They also show some sort of empathy towards us that partly actually takes place or is based on some acoustic interaction between humans and dogs. Obviously, this is not end of the story in research, but as a summary, I think, of this is really maybe these three examples showed for you, or try to be convincing in that sense, that really humans and dogs are sharing a lot of features that help in their joint life or in their interaction, and this obviously can give the owners this feeling that dogs are a very close social partner for them. There are some very interesting features that are probably specific to individual dogs. This is the word object labeling ability, or knowing this. Others, like this vocal interaction, is more generic, and most dogs actually are able to do it. And obviously the research for the future is really to find out whether these similarities or dissimilarities, or the degree of dissimilarities or dissimilarities between dogs and humans. And I think, or at least this is my sort of insight, and why I really love this research, and why this is really interesting, because working on dogs actually also answers or gives some questions about humans, or provides some new questions. And we always coming to this issue that when we are trying to compare the two species, that there are so many experiments missing from the humans part, because those experiments were never actually conducted, because people didn't thought that they might be interesting. So thank you very much for your attention and being with me, and I am really happy to stay here as long as you like answering questions.